Senator Lyons.
Thank you, Mr President. Yesterday in this place, Senator Abbott accused me of being loose with the truth and ignorant of remote Aboriginal communities in this state. The truth is, it is the Senator Back, who is out of touch. I did not, as he implied, join together the closure of communities with the closure of schools. But Senator Back, it seems, never lets the truth get in the way of a good story, because he went on to say he'd never heard the Barnett government say it was closing schools in remote Aboriginal communities, and said this was neither the time nor the place to be making spurious and false statements. Well, the false statements are all Senator Back's, as I did not make this claim. It is Senator Back who is out of touch, and tonight I will continue to put the truth in the Hansard and before the Australian people. For Senator Back's benefit, who allegedly, as he told the Senate, takes a keen interest in what's been made public, he seems to have missed this, and so I draw his attention to a piece in The Australian, and I quote, "Western Australian Premier Colin Barnett has admitted his government would be forced to close 150 of the state's remote Aboriginal homelands after accepting a one-off $90 million payment from the Abbott government to take over responsibility for municipal and essential services." But the real story starts with Minister Scullion. Earlier this year, in the Senate, Minister Scullion hailed an historic agreement with a number of states, including WA. This agreement involves state governments taking responsibility for municipal and essential services at all their remote Aboriginal homeland communities. However, the WA government did not hail Minister Scullion's agreement as a historic agreement or as a success. In fact, the WA Housing Minister described the move to end this funding from 1 July next year as reprehensible and said this would lead to the closure of camps, his words not mine. This was not an agreement, it was an ultimatum. We had a gun pointed at our head, Mr Marmion is on the public record as saying. The 150 of the 180 communities the Barnett government will close within the next 2 years is most of the homeland communities that the Commonwealth was funding in remote Western Australia and have been funding since the 1960s, more than 50 years. Withdrawing this funding will cost the state around $10 million over 20 years, according to Mr Marmion's published media. So it seems that both the state Liberal government and the Abbott government, indeed the Prime Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, have washed their hands of these small homeland communities, and both will be responsible when the state Liberals close these communities. These homeland communities have been funded by the Commonwealth since the 1960s, more than 50 years, which the Prime Minister and his Indigenous Affairs Minister think it's just okay to walk away from a 50-year commitment. That is disgraceful. And is it any wonder that Mr Warren Mundine, the head of the Prime Minister's Indigenous Advisory Council, has described this failure as, and I quote, almost like an infrastructure apartheid system. And while this buck-passing is going on, what is happening to these homeland communities? Well, it seems the same old is what's going on, despite the argy-bargy between the Commonwealth and state, which has obviously involved more than one meeting. Despite Mr Mundine's declaration that it was almost like an infrastructure apartheid system, which assumes Mr Mundine knows what's going on, and despite at least 3 out of the 4 shires in the Kimberley being willing, with funding of course, to pick up these municipal services, which implies again there has been some discussion with them, there has been no discussion with any of the homeland communities. No discussion with local Aboriginal leaders, no discussion at all. It's the old adage of white fellas' business. Or, we'll tell you what's going on, you don't need to be consulted, which is exactly what Colin Barnett did when he announced through the media that 150 homeland communities would close over the next 2 years. This was the first time that homeland communities got to learn that for some of the communities, in fact for most of the communities, the axe was hanging over their heads. Right now, my state Labor colleagues, Ben White, Shadow Treasurer, Aboriginal Affairs, Shadow for the Kimberley, amongst other things, and Josie Farah, member for the Kimberleys, are in the Kimberleys, and they're meeting with Homeland communities in Broome, in Luma, in Fitzroy, in Balgo and Halls Creek, to name just a few. And it has been confirmed to Ben and to Josie that all levels of government have had conversations about the future of Homeland communities, but no one has had conversation with leaders or anyone in these communities. These Homeland communities are people's home. Some have schools, some are dry. The people who live in these communities have different histories, they have different language groups, and in the past the Commonwealth has had policies which have encouraged the development and settlement of Homeland communities, and the Commonwealth has a long history of funding these communities. The truth is, these Homeland communities don't need to close, but it seems that Colin Barnett, the Prime Minister, and Minister Scullion will just close these communities. And what does that mean? Well, Josie Farah, a Gidja woman, member for the community, member for the Kimberleys, seen all this before. Josie's had first-hand personal experience, and I take a recollection from her first speech in a WA Parliament. Josie started school at Mullabulla. It closed in 1955, and all the Aboriginal families were forcibly removed from the property. Josie says we were relocated to Halls Creek so the station could be sold and run as a privately owned pastoral lease. Josie goes on to quote, "The story of my early life may seem a long, long time ago, but unfortunately the reality for many Kimberley Aboriginal people today is similar. In recent years, many people were forcibly removed from Umulgurri, not by packing them into a truck like we were, but by turning off services, not repairing power generation, switching off water and closing schools. They were sent packing to Wyndham before adequate housing was provided for them. Today we can drive into Wyndham and see many of these people sitting in the middle of town, still without homes, jobs, training or possessions. They are living hard in parks, bushes and mangroves." Is this the intention of the Prime Minister, the Minister Scullion and the Barnett government? Frog Hollow, a small Homeland community 150 k's from Halls Creek, has 11 houses, a school and a bore. What happens to this community? Will the Barnett government consult with this community or just go back to the old ways or the recent past and cut off the services? Who will take responsibility for rehousing? Where will the community go? What about Luma, a dry community? Will its residents be sent into town where liquor is freely available? Or Balgo, a large community where 400 residents, where will they go? Mr Barnett has shown his complete ignorance of these communities, as his government has described some of these communities as failing to develop. Well, the first matter which must be sorted out is land tenure. It is so convoluted, no one knows who owns what. So is it any wonder there's a failure to thrive when land is held in trust or marked as a reserve or held by the Aboriginal Lands Trust? This doesn't allow commercial loans or free use of land by Homeland communities. This is not a failure to thrive by the community. It's a failure of the federal government to continue its 50 years of funding to try and shunt this issue onto the state, and of the state as seeing the only solution being to close communities. This is not infrastructure apartheid, as described by the PM's man, Mr Mundine. This is racism. By not sitting down and not consulting with Homeland communities, this is a failure to acknowledge the First Peoples of our land. This is a failure to acknowledge ancient culture and connection to land. And this is a disgraceful act by the Abbott government, who by its actions in cutting funding have put at risk, once again, generations of families living on these homelands, and a failure by the Barnett government once again taking decision-making from those most affected by this decision and by simply declaring Homeland communities will close. Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President.